Imagine being the most powerful man in the known world. Your empire stretches from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of India. Millions kneel before you. Your word is absolute law. And yet, when you return home defeated, humiliated, desperate to forget the greatest military catastrophe of your reign, you don't turn to conquest or construction or prayer. You turn to your family. And what you do next destroys not just lives, but an entire branch of your royal house, sparking a rebellion that will echo through the centuries. The man was Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, and the woman at the center of this catastrophe was his own niece, married to his son and heir. What Xerxes did to her set in motion a chain of events so brutal, so unforgivable, that even the ancient historians who documented it could barely find the words to describe what happened next. This isn't a story about war. It's a story about power unchecked, desire unleashed, and the terrible price paid when a king believes he's above even the laws of family and decency. By the end, you'll understand why some acts of cruelty are worse than death itself. And you'll see why the woman who suffered most wasn't even the one Xerxes desired. Xerxes I ruled the Achaemenid Empire from 486 to 465 BC, inheriting an empire already at its zenith. His mother was Artaynte, daughter of Cyrus the Great, who had founded the empire, giving Xerxes impeccable royal bloodline. He wasn't the oldest son of his father Darius, but he was the firstborn after Darius took the throne, and his mother's prestigious lineage ensured his succession went smoothly. At his accession, Xerxes faced revolts in Egypt and Babylon, which he suppressed with ruthless efficiency. The Egyptian uprising was crushed in January 484 BC, and he appointed his brother Achaemenes as the new governor. But Babylon proved more troublesome. Two separate revolts erupted, the first led by a man named Bel-Shimani, lasting only 2 weeks. The second rebellion, under Shamash-Eriba, seized Babylon itself and required a lengthy siege before finally being defeated in March 481 BC. These weren't just military challenges. They were personal affronts to Xerxes' authority. And unlike his grandfather Cyrus, who had been tolerant and diplomatic, Xerxes responded with iron. He destroyed sacred temples. He melted down the golden statue of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, an act of sacrilege that shocked even his own advisors. Where his predecessors had ruled with a gentle hand, Xerxes ruled with a closed fist. Then came Greece, the campaign that would define his reign and ultimately destroy his reputation. Convinced by his cousin and brother-in-law Mardonius, Xerxes assembled what ancient historians claimed was the largest army ever assembled. Modern estimates suggest around 360,000 soldiers and a navy of 700 to 800 ships crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 480 BC. The early victories were promising. Thermopylae fell, though at tremendous cost. Athens was captured and burned. But then came Salamis, the naval disaster that shattered Persian naval power. By the end of that battle, Xerxes' fleet was in ruins and he feared for his own safety. He fled back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year at Plataea, the Persian land forces were crushed. The invasion was over. The dream of conquering Greece was finished, and Xerxes, humiliated, returned home. It was the winter of 480 to 479 BC. Xerxes had retreated to his winter quarters in Sardis, the wealthy city in western Anatolia, recovering from the disasters in Greece. His massive army had been scattered. His reputation as an invincible god-king had been shattered on the rocks of Salamis and in the wheat fields of Plataea. And in that vulnerable moment, with his confidence broken and his pride wounded, Xerxes' attention turned from warfare to something far more destructive. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote several decades after these events, Xerxes developed an obsession with a woman who should have been completely off-limits, the wife of Masistes, his own brother. Masistes was a full brother, born of the same mother, Atossa. He was not just family. He was a distinguished general who had served as one of the 6 chief marshals during the Greek campaign, and the satrap of Bactria, one of the most important positions in the empire. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes became infatuated with this unnamed woman and pursued her relentlessly. But unlike so many other targets of royal desire, she refused him. Again and again, she turned down the King of Kings. This was extraordinary. In a world where the king's word was law, where his desires were commands, where resistance could mean death, this unnamed woman stood firm. Out of what Herodotus describes as unusual respect for his brother, Xerxes didn't simply force himself on her. He could have. No one would have stopped him. The restraint suggests that even absolute monarchs sometimes recognized boundaries they feared to cross, perhaps understanding that violating his brother's wife would ignite a family conflict that could threaten the throne itself. But Xerxes didn't give up. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and if he couldn't have the mother through force, he would have her through manipulation. Xerxes devised a plan that was as calculated as it was twisted. He would arrange a marriage between his own son Darius, the crown prince and heir to the empire, and Masistes' daughter Artaynte. On the surface, this was perfectly appropriate. Royal intermarriage was common in the Persian court. Artaynte was Xerxes' niece, and such unions between cousins strengthened family bonds and consolidated power. The wedding was celebrated in Sardis around 478 BC. Musicians played, wine flowed, gifts were exchanged. Masistes, proud father of the bride, had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. His daughter was marrying the future emperor. It was an honor, a sign of the family's continued prominence despite the disasters in Greece. But based on what happened next, we can infer that Xerxes' motives were never about strengthening family ties. His plan appears to have been simple and sinister. By bringing Artaynte into his household as his daughter-in-law, she would be constantly present at court. He would have regular access to her mother, his true target. The wedding gift he really wanted was proximity to the woman who kept refusing him. Yet when the royal court returned to Susa, the capital, something unexpected happened. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes found himself drawn not to the mother, but to the daughter. Perhaps it was Artaynte's youth, her beauty, or simply the fact that she was there within his reach while her mother remained distant. Whatever the reason, Xerxes' obsession shifted from one woman to another within the same family. And this time, unlike her mother, Artaynte didn't refuse him. The affair that followed was conducted with the kind of brazen confidence that only absolute power provides. Artaynte was married to Darius, the crown prince. She was Xerxes' niece by blood. She was his daughter-in-law by marriage. Every layer of relationship made what they were doing not just scandalous, but fundamentally destabilizing to the royal family. Herodotus reports that when he approached her, she agreed to the affair. Whether this was genuine desire, fear of refusing a king, ambition for power and influence, or some combination of all three, we'll never know. What we do know is that the affair continued, conducted in secret but with the kind of recklessness that suggested Xerxes believed himself untouchable. And then, in a moment of passion, or perhaps calculated manipulation, Xerxes made a promise that would prove catastrophic. He told Artaynte that he would give her any gift she asked for. This was no small offer. When a Persian king made such a promise, tradition and honor demanded it be kept. It was the same kind of binding oath that, in Persian custom, could not be broken without destroying the king's credibility and authority. Artaynte's request was specific and shocking. She asked for the magnificent robe that Xerxes' wife Amestris had personally woven for him. This wasn't just any piece of clothing. In Persian culture, such garments carried deep symbolic weight. Some scholars argue the royal robe wasn't merely clothing, but a symbol of the Persian monarchy itself. When a woman wore the king's robe, she was making a statement about her position, her power, her place in the royal hierarchy. Xerxes knew immediately what a mistake he had made. He begged Artaynte to choose something else, anything else. He offered her cities, unlimited gold, even command of an army. These weren't empty offers. Xerxes genuinely tried to deflect her request because he understood the consequences. If Amestris saw Artaynte wearing that robe, she would know everything. But Artaynte insisted, and Xerxes, bound by his promise and perhaps unable to refuse the woman he'd become obsessed with, handed over the robe. Perhaps Artaynte was naive about what wearing it would mean. Perhaps she was deliberately making a power play, announcing her status as the king's favorite. Or perhaps she was simply a young woman caught up in something far beyond her understanding. Whatever her motivation, she wore the robe in public, and Queen Amestris saw it. Amestris was the daughter of Otanes, one of the 7 noblemen who had helped Darius take the throne by killing a false king in 522 BC. She wasn't some decorative consort. She came from one of the most powerful families in Persia, and she had been queen since Xerxes took the throne. Her position, her honor, her very identity were tied to being the king's primary wife. And now a young woman, her own niece by marriage, was parading through the palace wearing the robe Amestris herself had made for her husband. The message was clear. The humiliation was public. And Amestris' response would be calculated, cold, and absolutely merciless. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. When Amestris discovered the affair, she didn't seek revenge against Artaynte. She targeted Artaynte's mother, Masistes' wife, the woman who had been Xerxes' original obsession, the woman who had refused the king's advances. Why? Herodotus suggests Amestris blamed the mother for the daughter's behavior, believing she had raised Artaynte poorly or even encouraged the affair to gain power. But modern historians have proposed other interpretations. Perhaps Amestris understood that punishing Artaynte directly would put her in direct conflict with her own son Darius, Artaynte's husband, creating a succession crisis. Perhaps she suspected, correctly, that the mother had been Xerxes' first target, and saw her as the root cause of everything. Or perhaps, in Amestris' mind, this was about sending a message to anyone who might have designs on the king. The mutilation she ordered was typically reserved for rebels and traitors in Persian culture, suggesting she viewed this as a form of treason against the royal household. Amestris waited for the perfect moment, the king's birthday celebration. According to Herodotus, Persian custom held this as a sacred occasion when tradition demanded the king grant any request made of him. It was a trap of Xerxes' own making, the same kind of binding promise that had forced him to give Artaynte the robe. Now his wife would use that same tradition against him. When Amestris made her request, she asked for Masistes' wife to be delivered to her. Xerxes understood immediately what his wife intended. He pleaded with Amestris to ask for anything else, just as he had pleaded with Artaynte about the robe. But Amestris, like Artaynte before her, would not be moved, and Xerxes, trapped by his own customs and traditions, had to comply. What happened next is recorded by Herodotus in disturbing detail. Amestris sent for Xerxes' personal guards and ordered them to mutilate Masistes' wife, cutting off her breasts and throwing them to dogs, cutting off her nose, ears, and lips, and cutting out her tongue as well, before sending her home in this horrific state. This wasn't execution. Execution would have been mercy. This was deliberate, calculated torture designed to destroy not just a life, but an identity, to transform a woman into a living horror, a walking monument to the price of crossing the queen. The specific mutilations Amestris ordered were typically reserved for rebels and traitors to the empire, according to Persian custom. Amestris was making a statement. This woman had committed treason against the royal household, and the true horror? This woman was innocent. She had refused Xerxes' advances. She had done everything right. She had remained loyal to her husband and family, and for that virtue, for that loyalty, she paid a price worse than death. When Masistes saw what had been done to his wife, he fled immediately toward Bactria, his satrapy in the east, determined to raise a revolt against his brother. It's impossible to imagine his rage, his grief, his sense of betrayal. His wife had been tortured because Xerxes couldn't control his desires. His daughter had been seduced by his own brother. His family had been destroyed by the man who was supposed to protect them. The rebellion never had a chance. Xerxes, learning of his brother's plans, sent troops to intercept him. According to Herodotus, Masistes was caught before he reached Bactria and was killed along with his sons. The entire male line of Masistes was wiped out in a matter of weeks. And what of Artaynte, the young woman whose request for a robe had set all of this in motion? Herodotus provides no clear information about her fate. Some modern scholars infer that she and her household may have been executed as well, caught up in the purge that followed Masistes' attempted revolt, though Herodotus only explicitly mentions that she and her husband Darius survived this gruesome story. She had been used by a king, destroyed a family, and the historical record falls silent on what became of her afterward. The entire episode lasted perhaps a year, from the first inappropriate glance in Sardis to the final executions in Bactria. But in that brief time, Xerxes had destroyed his own brother's family, sparked a civil war, and revealed to his entire court that the King of Kings could not control even his own household. The story of Xerxes and Artaynte comes primarily from Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote his histories in the mid-5th century BC, several decades after these events occurred. Modern scholars recognize that while the story is rich in dramatic detail, it's likely embellished and maybe partly fictional. The Encyclopedia Iranica, a comprehensive scholarly resource on Persian history, states that the story is rich in fiction and as a whole, without doubt, is invented by Herodotus himself. However, historians generally agree there must have been some historical basis to it, some real quarrel between Xerxes and Masistes that ended in the destruction of Masistes' family. Persian records from the period don't survive in enough detail to confirm or deny the story, but Masistes disappears from historical records around 478 BC, which fits the timeline Herodotus provides. What's particularly telling is that even Greek writers who despised Xerxes and happily portrayed him as a tyrant seem genuinely disturbed by this story. The way Herodotus structures the narrative, with its emphasis on broken promises, divine retribution, and the destruction of families, suggests he saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked royal power. The story also fits patterns we know were real in Persian royal politics. Marriages between close relatives were common. Court intrigues were deadly. Queens wielded significant power and could be ruthlessly protective of their positions. Rebellions by satraps were constant threats. The detail about the royal robe being a symbol of monarchy rather than just clothing has support in Persian cultural sources from the period. Even if the specific details are exaggerated or dramatized, the framework is authentic. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the violence or even the incest. It's the systematic way that absolute power corrupted every relationship it touched. Xerxes couldn't accept the word no from a woman, so he manipulated his own son's marriage to get closer to his target. When that plan backfired and he became obsessed with his niece instead, he couldn't restrain himself even though she was married to his heir. When he made a foolish promise, he couldn't break it even though he knew it would expose everything. And when his wife sought revenge, he couldn't protect the innocent victim, because custom demanded he grant her request. At every turn, the structures of absolute monarchy made the worst outcomes inevitable. The king's word was law, so his promises became traps. The king's desires were commands, so his lusts became catastrophes. The king's family were pawns, so their lives became collateral damage. And the king's subjects had no recourse, no protection, no way to escape when royal dysfunction consumed them. The woman who suffered most did everything right. She refused the king's advances. She remained loyal to her husband. She raised her daughter. And for all of that virtue, she was tortured beyond recognition, turned into a monster and left to live with her suffering as a warning to anyone else who might dare to maintain their dignity when royal power demanded submission. That's what makes the story so dark. It's not just about one bad king or one moment of weakness. It's about what happens when power has no limits, when authority has no checks, when the whims of rulers can destroy lives without consequence. Artaynte paid for her involvement. Masistes and his sons paid for seeking justice. But the woman who paid the highest price was the one who had done nothing wrong at all. Xerxes would rule for another 14 years after these events, dying in August, 465 BC. Ancient sources disagree on the exact sequence of events, but most accounts agree that Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, assassinated Xerxes with the help of a eunuch named Amestris. Some sources say Artabanus killed Xerxes first, then manipulated his son Artaxerxes into killing the crown prince Darius by falsely accusing Darius of the murder. Other sources claim Artabanus killed Darius first, then killed Xerxes to avoid punishment. Either way, the assassination marked the end of a reign that had begun with such promise and inherited such power, but is now remembered primarily for failure. The failed Greek campaign, the brutal suppression of revolts, the family scandals that destroyed his own brother's household, and finally, the violent death in a palace conspiracy that marked the beginning of the empire's long decline. Greek writers portrayed him as weak, controlled by women, unable to control even his own household. Persian sources, what few survive, are more charitable, but can't hide the reality that his reign marked a turning point. His grandfather Cyrus was called the Great for his conquests and wisdom. His father Darius was called the Great for his administrative genius. Xerxes earned no such title. He was simply Xerxes, the king who lost Greece and destroyed his own family. The story of Artaynte and Masistes' wife became, in Greek literature, the ultimate example of Eastern decadence, of the corruption that came from too much power concentrated in too few hands. It was propaganda, certainly, but like all effective propaganda, it worked because it contained a kernel of truth that resonated. And somewhere in the historical record, lost among the grand battles and political intrigues, is a woman whose name we don't even know. The wife of Masistes, the mother of Artaynte, who refused a king and paid for that refusal with everything. Her story is the one that haunts this episode because it reveals the ultimate truth about power without accountability. The innocent don't just suffer. They suffer in ways designed to break them, to humiliate them, to ensure their torment serves as a warning to everyone else who might dare to maintain their dignity in the face of royal desire. That's the real horror Xerxes unleashed, not in Greece where armies clashed and empires contested for supremacy, but in his own palace, where a woman's virtue became the excuse for her destruction, where a king's lust became a family's catastrophe, and where the most powerful man in the world proved powerless to protect anyone, even from himself. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand the darker corners of ancient history where power and tragedy collide, hit that like button and subscribe to The Codex of History. Because the past isn't just about great victories and noble deeds. Sometimes it's about the moments when everything went wrong, when the powerful proved monstrous, and when innocent people paid the price for games they never chose to play. And those stories, as dark as they are, need to be told too.